Still, the idea that this was the work of a suicidal vampire was far-fetched. It seemed much more likely that they simply didn't know any better. "It's getting worse," Bella said. I hadn't realized she had been reading over my shoulder. "Altogether out of control," I said, more to myself than to her. This can't be the work of just one newborn vampire. What's going on? It's as if they'd never heard of the Volturi, which is possible, I guess. No one has explained the rules to them. So who is creating them, then? "The Volturi?" she asked, panicked. "This is exactly the kind of thing they routinely wipe out. Immortals who threaten to expose us. They just cleaned up a mess like this a few years ago in Atlanta, and it hadn't gotten nearly this bad. They will intervene soon, very soon, unless we can find some way to calm the situation. I'd really rather they didn't come to Seattle just now. As long as they're this close, they might decide to check on you." Her eyes were wide with terror, and she looked paler than usual. "What can we do?" "We need to know more before we can decide that. Perhaps if we can talk to these young ones, explain the rules, it can be resolved peacefully." Even as I said it, my words felt impossible. I couldn't imagine reasoning with a group of newborns who had already proven they had absolutely no self-control. "We'll wait until Alice has an idea of what's going on. We don't want to step in until it's absolutely necessary. After all, it's not our responsibility." I didn't want it to end in a fight. We already had enough to deal with, and Carlyle hated the idea of killing anyone, even if they themselves were merciless killers. Cringing, I remembered how difficult it had been for him to admit that killing James was the only answer. Emmett, I feared, would be all too eager to take on a group of newborns. If the rest of us weren't here to rein him in, he'd probably already be in Seattle. His headstrong, confident nature was usually not a problem, but in this case it made me nervous. He didn't fully understand what we were up against. "But it's good we have Jasper," I said softly, grateful for the first time for his brutal history. "If we're dealing with newborns, he'll be helpful." "Jasper? Why?" she asked. I smiled, despite my trepidation. He would most likely be happy to know his past was finally going to be good for something. "Jasper is sort of an expert on young vampires." "What do you mean, an expert?" "You'll have to ask him. The story is involved. Involved and brutal, and therefore censored. I, of course, knew every detail, and over the decades I had lost track of what he'd actually spoken aloud and what I had learned through inadvertent listening. I respected him and his privacy enough not to say much about his past, for fear of revealing something he had intended to keep to himself. He would never admit, not even to Alice, the extent to which the guilt still plagued him over the atrocities he was involved in, and how it was made worse for him every time he felt his self-restraint weaken. "What a mess," Bella mumbled. Exactly what I was thinking. "It does feel that way, doesn't it? Like it's coming at us from all sides these days." My own guilt once again set in when I thought of all the different ways I was risking the life of the person I had sworn to protect. If it wasn't vindictive vampires bent on revenge, or the werewolves whose arms I'd basically thrown her into, it was out-of-control newborns who happened to have chosen the Northwest for their rampage. Okay, technically that wasn't my fault, but if it weren't for me, Bella would believe it was just some serial killer like everyone else. Instead, she had to live with the fear that came with knowing the truth. I sighed, hating how thoroughly I seemed to have disrupted her life. "Do you ever think your life might be easier if you weren't in love with me?" I asked miserably. "Maybe. It wouldn't be much of a life, though." "For me," I whispered, overcome by the unconditional love I saw when I looked into her eyes. It was more than I deserved. In that instant, I remembered what I had overheard her talking to Jacob about. I had taken so much from her. The least I could do was try to give her anything or everything that made her happy, no matter how insane it seemed to me. "And now?" I said, smiling with as much sincerity as I could muster, considering what I was about to say. "I suppose you have something you want to ask me?" She looked generally perplexed. "I do?" "Or maybe not," I said, smiling. Who was I to remind her if she had already conveniently forgotten? "Be reasonable. Give her what makes her happy," I reminded myself. I was rather under the impression that you had promised to ask my permission to go to some kind of werewolf soiree tonight. Eavesdropping again? She didn't sound surprised, or particularly bothered. For some reason that made me smile. Just a bit, at the very end. Well, I wasn't going to ask you anyway. I figured you had enough to stress about. Yet again, she was giving me more than I deserved. I took a step closer to her, until I could feel her heart pounding in her chest. I reached up to cradle her face, and watched her eyes carefully as I asked the question I was sure I already knew the answer to. Would you like to go? It's no big thing, she lied. Don't worry about it. You don't have to ask my permission, Bella. I'm not your father. Thank heaven for that. Perhaps you should ask Charlie, though. But you know Charlie will say yes, she said, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. I'd have to remember that smile while she was away, to remind myself why I was momentarily sacrificing my sanity. I do have a bit more insight into his probable answer than most people would, it's true. One of the most constant trends in Charlie's often confused mind was that Jacob was good, someone to be trusted. The peace that seemed to wash over him when he thought of Jacob and Bella being together was rivaled only by the concern he felt when he thought of her relationship with me. I felt concerned I would never completely undo the damage I had done by leaving her, at least as far as Charlie was concerned. I couldn't expect to, really, not when I had thought of what he'd been put through, taking care of Bella during those desolate months. I watched as first confusion and then indecision washed over Bella's face. I knew she wanted to go, but she was finally considering my feelings on the matter, the way I had wanted her to all along. It gave me even more confidence in my decision. Bella, I said, looking deeply into her eyes, so she knew I meant it. I told you that I'm going to be reasonable and trust your judgment. I meant that. If you trust the werewolves, then I'm not going to worry about them. Wow, she said, still watching me with disbelieving eyes. And Jacob was right. About one thing, anyway. A pack of werewolves ought to be enough to protect even you for one evening. I nearly laughed. I wondered if they realized keeping Bella safe was a full-time job. Are you sure? She was giving me an out, a guilt-free escape that would keep her beside me instead of relinquishing her to the care of the wolves. I considered taking it, but the smile that was threatening to break through her expression reminded me that my first and foremost task was keeping her happy. I owed her that much, for all she had been through because of me. Of course, I said, my smile locked in place. Only... It was with great difficulty that I was entrusting her to Jacob's watch, something I was sure Bella was aware of, and I felt certain she would grant my few small requests. I hope you won't mind taking a few precautions, allowing me to drive you to the boundary line, for one, and then taking a cell phone, so that I'll know when to pick you up. That sounds very reasonable, she hedged, clearly waiting for the catch. Excellent, I said, as calmly as I could manage. There was no point in letting her know I was screaming on the inside. No good could come of showing her how miserable the idea of handing her over to a pack of immature dogs made me. She wanted to spend time with them, and I had no right to refuse. I had left her, hurt her in the most inexcusable way, and I had sworn that if it took my entire existence, I would make it up to her. I just hated that my vow involved letting her go where I could not follow. I listened with measured patience as Bella spoke with Jacob, explaining that I had agreed to drive her to the boundary line, and that I would pick her up when the bonfire was over. Though I tried not to listen to Jacob's side of the conversation, it was impossible not to hear the smugness in his tone.